Hello, my name is Sophie and welcome back to my channel. We're getting to the end of the 2024 review content, but we haven't got there yet. So one of the challenges, I suppose, I set myself last year was to have an annual TBR of doing 24 books in 2024. And I was excited about this because 24 is divisible by 12. So it was really easy to set a certain number of books to read per month, too. I don't know why I said a certain number, like it isn't really obviously two. It was really easy to set 2 books per month, and in theory, the challenge would be easily completed. However, I was still learning about my own reading habits when I was setting my monthly TBRs at the beginning of last year. So I think my TBR for last January was like 11 books long, and I read 5, and neither of them were from my 24 and 2024. So I'm going to leave you in a little bit of suspense on how well I technically did. But I'm going to talk you through the 24 books I chose, what I rated them, and whether or not I read them and what I rated them, because obviously I wouldn't rate them if I didn't read them. Anyway, I'm doing this based off what's in my 2024 book journal, which I did want to just say, shall I do a flip through of my finished journal? Because I filled in the pages that were remaining at the end and the whole book is now finished. So if you'd like me to do a page by page flip through and a kind of description of how I used all the pages and how useful I found them, please do let me know. The way I ordered these stickers in my book journal was by author's surname, so there's no other preferential reason for the books to be in this order. It's just done alphabetically by author's surname. So the first book on my list is The Cheat Sheet by Sarah Adams, which in fact was one of the first books I read from this list last year, and I actually hated it. I rated it 2 stars. I actually started hate tabbing it. Every bit that made me cringe, I started putting tabs in, and I genuinely think I was putting a tab in at least once every other page. I used probably over 100 tabs in that book, which I'm going to have to take all of them out before I either put it on Vinted or donate it. But yeah, this book just wasn't for me. What I learned about myself in 2024 and my reading habits, or what I enjoy from books, is that obviously romance is my favorite genre. I love reading romance books, but I find with the friends to lovers trope, it can be really tricky because if they're friends that already are in love with each other, I don't find that interesting to read about because they already know what they love about the other person. And what I like from romance is watching them fall for each other, if not getting to know each other. So I lose out on those aspects of things I enjoy about those books because they already know each other. They're already each other's best friends. And with this book, I think by page 30, they'd both, in their own perspectives, said, "Oh, I love the other person so much, but they're never going to want to be with me, blah, 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 blah." I didn't love The Cheat Sheet. The entire reason I bought it is because the female main character was a dancer, and the dancing did just not feature heavily enough for me to enjoy it. So I rated this 2 stars. It was not my favourite book from my 24 and 2024, but I did read it, so it's a tick in that regard. Then the second book on my list is The Fine Print by Lauren Asher. And considering what I just said about cringy romance tropes, you'd think I also wouldn't like this one. But I rated this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't that good, don't get me wrong. It was definitely in the line of trashy romance, especially with the whole billionaire thing. But I just found them kind of endearing and I enjoyed it. I can't tell you for why. I feel like with those books, it can be very hit or miss. And at the beginning, I thought it was going to be a miss, but by the end, I was actually very much enjoying it. So it wasn't particularly memorable. I can't exactly say that I remember every detail of this book intricately, but I did enjoy it, and I would like to read the other 2 at some point. Then in number 3, we have Legends of Lattes by Travis Baldree, which is one I thought was going to be a new 6-star book for me. I thought this was going to be a genre-defining book. And don't get me wrong, I still rated it 4 stars. I did enjoy it, but it was only 4 stars. I found, considering I read this after reading another book on this list, which is 2.5 times as long, I thought the pacing in this one would not even be in question because it was just over or less than 300 pages long. Like, it's relatively short, especially for a fantasy book. But it was just so slow. And I think that's kind of part of the thing with cozy fantasy, is that it is low stakes, but there's low stakes and then there's no stakes. And even though there were some stakes and there was a tiny bit of plot, a lot of it was about the running of a coffee shop. And once the coffee shop is up and running, that gets a bit monotonous. So I did find the pacing was a bit slow in places, but it was still 4 stars. I still enjoyed it. I liked the characters. I liked the fantasy setting, but I'm not rushing to get the prequel, sequel bookshops and bone dust, even though it's about a bookshop, which normally I would be absolutely sold on. So yeah, Legends and Lattes was arguably closer to a 3.5 than a 4, but I rated it 4 at the time, so that's what I'm going with. Then in at number 4, we have Strong Female Character by Fern Brady, and this was an easy 5 stars. This is a non-fiction memoir about Fern's journey, realizing she's autistic and eventually getting diagnosed and recognizing her own autistic traits. And as someone who has her own autism assessment next week now, I just found it incredibly insightful. And I found it interesting how much I could empathize with Fern, despite having not been through a lot of the things she's been through. But I could recognize the autistic parts of her journey. Oh, I don't like using the word journey, but you know what I mean. The autistic parts of her life and the autistic parts of my life as two women who didn't have their autism recognized in childhood. It was just really, really fascinating, and definitely one that has to be read as an audiobook, because hearing Fern narrate her own story just gave it a whole different impact for sure. Then we get to the first one I didn't read. In at number 5, we have the official Stranger Things novel, Darkness on the Edge of Town by Adam Christopher. This is a story about the character Hopper, and Hopper is one of my favourite characters from the show. And I think this one went on to my monthly TBRs at least twice, and I didn't get around to reading it. It's quite long and a little bit intimidating. And I think now, knowing that I didn't manage to read it last year, I think what I'd like to do is read it before the next season of Stranger Things comes out. I want to do like a massive Stranger Things binge. I'd like to reread the other Stranger Things novel that I have read, which was called, I can't remember what it's called, but I'll put a picture of it up here. Absolutely adored that book, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to love this one as well. But just haven't read it yet. So when the next series of Stranger Things has a release date, I want to reread the Gwenda Bond book, read the Adam Christopher book. There's another book that focuses on the character Eddie, which I also have, and then we'll rewatch the whole series before the new series comes out. Then in at number 6 is another one I didn't get around to reading, Gwen and Art Are Not in Love by Lex Croucher. I think especially with the way I chose to read these books, a lot of the time it wasn't like, I didn't really mood read this list. At first I kind of came up with different patterns. At first I picked the books based on vague mood reading, like which ones I wanted to read. Then it was, well, I've started at the end of the list, so I'll work my way backwards. Then it was, oh, well, I'll alternate between the front end and the back end of the list. And then I ended up putting them all in the spinner and letting the spinner choose what I read. So the fact that I didn't get around to reading this one doesn't feel like a sign of not being interested in it. It was just a case of it didn't come up on the spinner. It just didn't come up, so I didn't get around to it. I'm still, all the books I didn't get around to reading, I am still interested in reading all of them. I just haven't done it yet. So Gwen and Art Are Not in Love is one that I didn't get around to, but I'm still excited about reading it. In at number 7, we have Girl Goddess Queen by B. Fitzgerald, which is a Hades and Persephone retelling, which I was a bit nervous about reading because early last year I finished reading a whole Hades and Persephone saga, which was 7 books long, and I was a bit hesitant going into another saga and trying to keep them separate in my mind and keep the characters separate. But I rated this 5 stars. I thought it was so much fun. It was really, actually, I think having also read another Hades and Persephone retelling made me appreciate this one more, because I could recognize aspects of the stories that I already knew and appreciate the characters for how they were differently presented. And I also liked that this was written as a YA book, but it didn't shy away from the sexuality that is in a lot of Greek mythology. Because I think the thing with YA is that obviously we don't want to see smut in YA, because we don't need to see or read about minors doing smutty things. Like, please don't confuse my opinion on that at all. I do not want to be reading YA smut. But I think pretending that teenagers don't know anything about the components of smutty content is ridiculous, because, teenagers are renowned for being excessively hormonal and horny. So they're aware of it, they're talking about it, but we don't need to see them doing it. I think that line was really, really well cemented and respected within this book. It was so much fun. And I immediately went out to buy B's next book, which is, I think, about Helen of Troy. I didn't then read it, but that's not the point. Then in at number 8, we have Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. I really, really wanted to get around to this because it sounds like such a fun concept. It was on my 10 before the end. I think I tried to put it on my monthly TBR in December, just didn't have time for it. I did manage to read 69 books last year, so it's not like I didn't read a lot for me, but Immortal Longings just didn't quite make it. It's still up there in my priorities. I still really, really want to read it. Just didn't get around to it. So that's a cross on that one. Then at number 9, again, we have another cross. We have The Making of Another Major Motion Picture Masterpiece by Tom Hanks. This one is mostly intrigue. I want to see what Tom Hanks is like as a writer and see if any of his kind of personal voice comes through, or if it is completely ghostwritten and they've just slapped his name on it kind of for the sake of it. Yeah, this one is almost exclusively intrigue. I don't think I've heard anyone talking about this book, so I have no expectations, which is arguably the best way to go into a book. So I'm sure that will be great when I do get around to reading it, but I did not read it in 2024. We do have a run of books I didn't read now, because at number 10 we have Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, which is another one I put on my 10 before the end, and I get my 10 before the end and my December TBR muddled up because they were kind of the same thing in the end. I think if I'm going to do a 10 before the end this year, I need to do it at the beginning of November because I almost never read 10 books in a month. The only month since I've been tracking my reading that I have read more than 10 books in a month is the month where I went on my honeymoon and all I did was sit by a pool and read. So obviously I'm not replicating that in my everyday life. But anyway, Stone Blind is another one. It's another Greek retelling. I love Greek retellings. I love Greek mythology. This one's a different perspective on Medusa's story, which I think is going to be really fascinating. And I know Natalie Haynes is a really big name in Greek mythology retellings. So I am very excited about this. I just didn't quite get around to it. And I feel like that's going to get really repetitive and boring throughout this video because the same can be said for number 11, which was Verity by Colleen Hoover. I have been intrigued about Colleen Hoover since I read It Ends With Us, and I know it may be controversial, but I did actually really enjoy that book. And I have a friend who enjoys Colleen Hoover's books, and I saw her this week, and she was begging me to read Verity. She told me I need to make it my priority. I get nervous talking about Colleen Hoover because she seems to be so divisive online. I suppose if I want to keep this short and sweet, I didn't get around to reading Verity last year, but I would still consider it a priority, and I do still want to read it. And I'm not going to say any more because I'm scared about talking about her as an author. But then we get back onto books I have read. In at number 12, we have Guild by Raven Kennedy, which is the first book in the Plated Prisoner series. I actually rated this book 3 stars, and I didn't particularly enjoy it, but there was something about it that tugged on me and made me want to read the rest of the series. So I managed to find the audiobooks available at my library, or at least for the first 3 books. So I listened to the first one, then I went on to listen to the second and the third one. The second one I still think was kind of unnecessary. Books 1 and 2 just felt like nothing happened, and I didn't really like any of the characters. And I was like, why have I just read 300 plus pages of nothing? Like nothing is going on here. But book 3 is where it starts getting actually good. It's where the characters start to turn a little bit and they actually become engaging and you actually start to care about them. And there's an actual plot and there's an actual enemy and it all makes more sense. So I would argue that the first 2 books either could have been condensed into one or could have been like summarized as opening chapters to book 3. I don't know if they were entirely necessary, but then also on the flip side, were they necessary to get me to a point where I enjoyed book 3? But I shouldn't have to read through 2 whole books that I don't enjoy to get to a book that I do. So still up in the air about that one, but I do have the audiobook for book 4 on my Libro FM account because for some reason my library only has books 1, 2 and 3, which feels a bit odd. If you're going to have a series, at least finish the series. But I read books 1 to, well, I read book 1, rated it 3 stars, but then went on to read book 2 and 3. So that's quite a success in terms of my 24 and 2024 And hopefully I'll be able to finish this series this year. Okay, we're only just halfway through, and I'm really haven't handled that nattering thing, so we'll try and hurry up. Book number 13 was The Life-Changing Magic of Not Giving a Fuck by Sarah Knight. I rated this 3.5 stars, but I think I wrote this in my review. I don't know if it was in my journal or on Instagram, that if I had read this book before I read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson, I probably would have swapped their ratings, because the content of those two books is very, very similar. It just happens to be that I read this one after The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. But also, I think I did just prefer the narrative style of The Subtle Art more than I did The Life-Changing Magic. It felt a little bit cringy. I didn't necessarily love the writing style of this one, but the principles were all there. The principles were all the same as The Subtle Art. The general principle is not about not caring about things. It's just about putting your energy into caring about the right things. And I think I definitely need to try to embrace more of that philosophy throughout my life. But yeah, this book was fine. I'm glad I've read it. 3.5 stars. Then at number 14, this was one of the books I picked out of my TBR jar. It's called 0. 4 by Mike Lancaster. This is a book I bought as a teenager and read as a teenager, but wanted to reread as an adult to see if I still cared enough about it to keep it in my collection. And I rated it 4 stars, and I am keeping it. I would consider it, I think it's definitely a sci-fi book, but I think when most people, when you think about sci-fi, you generally think about books set in the future or in space. And this one's definitely more of a contemporary, modern day sci-fi. It's like if you were going to diverge into a parallel universe, this book is at the point where it diverges. It just felt so possible. It was a really, really interesting concept, and I think a really interesting narrative style, considering it was about, I think the main character, I think, was 15, relatively young. Young enough that sometimes I can find the narrative style a little bit annoying because I'm so far removed from being 15. But I really, really enjoyed this, and I will confidently be keeping it in my collection. Thoroughly recommend. If you want something that's going to make you think a bit about humanity without kind of being despairing, it's really fascinating. One book that was less fascinating was book 15, which is The Worst of Me by Kate Levan. This is another one that came out of my TBR jar, and another one that I think I bought when I was a teenager, because this is a very, very YA romance. Well, is it a romance? It was almost more contemporary fiction, but it was only 190 something pages long, and I rated this 3 stars, and I genuinely think it needed another 50 pages, because it felt like in the last 20 pages, that was the third act. And a massive thing happened, and there wasn't really any resolution. And then it just ended feeling very inconclusive. Initially, I was thinking of rating it higher because I really enjoyed the way that the narrative completely summarized how messy it feels to be a teenager, and being really self-aware of how messy everything feels, but not being able to comprehend or understand how to manage these massive emotions and feelings you're having for the first time. I thought that was a really interesting part of the narrative that I thought was really well done. But then, the romance element of the plot, it was like it was trying to cover a big, difficult topic, but it didn't quite do it enough. It wasn't particularly well executed. I'm not sure. I can't remember if I put this one in my donate pile or not, but I don't think I'll be keeping this one in my collection. In at number 16, we have House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This was the super long book I read before Legends and Lattes. I was intimidated by this book because I think the audiobook was it was nearly 28 hours. The book itself is 800 pages, almost exactly, I think. And I was concerned about pacing, because a book that long, I was worried it was going to get slow. And everything I've heard people talking about with this series is that it's a lot of world building and a lot of setup. And even though I was intimidated going in, I have to say that completely disregards everything I'd heard, because I don't think the world building was good, and there was a lot of it. Some of it I did have to let go over my head, otherwise I would have got too bogged down in the details. But I thought the pacing was great. I thought there was an actual plot. There was some main characters that I really liked and enjoyed spending time with. The plot moved really swiftly, not really swiftly, but at a good pace. And there was no point throughout the whole of those 28 hours where I was bored. I was excited to go back to listen to it. And I think I managed to listen to the whole thing in about 3 weeks, which for a book that long, considering I do most of my audiobook listening when I'm driving, is a really decent. It didn't feel long or slow at all, especially considering there's another super long audiobook on this list that took me 3 months to listen to. It didn't take me 3 months. I wasn't bored. I actually was very engaged throughout the whole thing. I'm not rushing to read book 2 because I had a couple of comments on TikTok telling me that I need to, or unless I want some spoilers for A Court of Thorns and Roses, I need to read that series first. So I'm going to read that series first, especially because I have all of the ACOTAR series and I don't even own book 2 in Crescent City. But I really enjoyed it, and I fully intend to read ACOTAR so that I can get back to reading this series, and I rated it 5 stars. Book 17 on my list is One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus, which is a YA mystery thriller, and I devoured this. I really, really enjoyed it. The only reason I rated it 4 stars rather than 5 is because I could predict the ending. I figured out how it was going to end. I found it a bit disappointing for it to have been that predictable. It was a 4 stars rather than a 5, but I loved the characterization. The audiobook was amazing because there are 4 narrators in this story and they each had their own voice actors. So they were really, really well defined. And again, I went on to borrow the whole series as audiobooks from my library. And book 3 in the series, I actually rated 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed this series, and I will almost certainly be coming back to it because it was such a fun time. Then in at number 18, we have The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides, and it's another book I rated 5 stars. This is the year that I can't talk. I made the realization that I do like mystery thrillers and I need to read more of them, but I need to figure out where to get recommendations for them. Because normally, especially with like fantasy and romance books, I'm sucked in by the covers. A good cover is enough to sell me. But I think mystery thriller books, generally as a genre, just don't have that enticing covers. Not to me, anyway. So, based on the fact that I loved the One of Us is Lying series, and I also loved the reappearance of Rachel Price by Holly Jackson, and I adored The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. If you have any mystery thriller recommendations, or you know someone who reads a lot of mystery thrillers and gives good recommendations based on the things I like, please let me know, because I clearly need to read more. But yeah, The Silent Patient was just incredible. I would consider The Silent Patient to be a modern classic, and it absolutely deserves that status. It's such clever writing. Again, the audiobook was really, really well performed. The twist at the end just absolutely shocked me. I definitely didn't see that one coming, and I thought the ending was really, really satisfying. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Genuinely could not recommend more highly. I think this is the kind of mystery thriller that anyone could enjoy. We're on to the last line. Number 19, we have Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This is my first Alice Oseman book outside the Heartstopper universe, and I also rated it 5 stars. I had some fantastic books on this list. At first, I found the main character a little bit irritating, but I think that's intentional. I think she's meant to be a kind of uptight, academic-focused character, and then she loosens up and develops as the book goes on. But this book was just so wonderful. I think Alice Oseman has a fantastic way of writing in a really easy-to-read style, but addressing quite hard topics in a really accessible way. The main themes of this book were identity and friendship and mental health, and they were just addressed so beautifully. These characters are stunning. And I mean, if they can do such a good adaptation of Heartstopper, I cannot wait to see if they do Alice's other books, because Radio Silence is beautiful. And I think it would be a really important message to give to teenagers about the pressure and academic pressure they put on themselves. We've made it into the 20s. In at number 20, we have, not in at number 20, these aren't ranked. I just numbered them because it is a 24 book list. But number 20 is The Book of Two Ways by Jodi Picoult. And I read this book quite early on in the year, and it feels like a lifetime ago. And this is a book that I rated 4 stars, but the whole time I was reading it, I was convinced I was going to give it 3 because it felt slow. I didn't understand quite what was going on. I thought I understood what was happening, but then it didn't quite make sense. But then the twist at the end, which explains it all and ties it together, was so clever and so well done. It made so much sense that I had to give it 4 stars. I couldn't give it 5 because of the fact that I'd considered it a 3-star book throughout most of my reading experience. But I would really like to reread this one and see how different I feel about it, knowing how it's going to end. Into the last 4, at number 21, we have Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Now, this is another one of those books that is super TikTok viral. And at first, I was like, yeah, this sounds so good. I'm all over it. And then I saw some amazing reviews, and then I saw some scathing reviews, and then I didn't know what to think. I was like, okay, well, I've put this book on my list. I have the book physically. I've bought the Works special edition sprayed edges of the novella and the sequel. Like, I've committed to this series, so I really need to read it. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I think at first it felt very fanfiction-y. The main character felt very not like other girls and like very self-insert fanfiction. And then as the story went on, I was like, God, this just feels so much like the Hunger Games. It gave me really strong Hunger Games vibes. But then also the whole story gave me a sense of nostalgia, even though it's a new book and I have no nostalgia attached to it. It just made me feel nostalgic for those dystopian fantasy books that were really popular when I was a teenager. So the fact that this made me feel so strongly nostalgic, despite being a new read to me, I rated it 4.5. I enjoyed it. The characters weren't perfect. It was all very predictable. Especially the 2 protagonist characters and their romance and the whole knife to the throat thing, it was very reminiscent of all of those dystopian books and dystopian adaptations that were popular when I was a teenager in the 2010s. And you can tell that Lauren Roberts is a woman of that era who grew up with those books. It's not the most original piece of fiction. It's not the most original characters. Even the, fantasy world magic scheme isn't that original. But I had fun. And you know what? It's my rating system. I don't have to rate something objectively. I'm rating everything subjectively. This is my opinion. And I gave it 4.5 stars. I didn't rush to read the novella or the sequel straight away. I will read them at some point. But I really enjoyed Powerless. Then in at number 22, we have the first book in the King Khalid Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind. So when I started reading this book, I didn't own it, which the main thing with this list for me is being able to get through some of my backlist. Except the reason that this book made it on is because I went to a Waterstones that had a whole basement level of sale section, and I picked up this novella called The Slow Regard of Silent Things for £3 because the cover was damaged. Except it didn't, either I didn't notice or it didn't say anywhere on the book that that was a spin-off novella and you can't read it without reading the rest of the series first. So this was my start on reading the series first so that I can get to reading the novella. This is the long audiobook that took me 3 months to finish. I think, again, it would have been 27 or 28 hours, but it was the first audiobook I read in 2024, I think, and it took me 3 months. I don't know if I was just out of the habit of listening to audiobooks or if I just wasn't driving so much, or maybe it was the book itself. I don't really know, but it took me a really long time. But then when I think on it, the pacing was fine. I found every time I came back into the book, I didn't feel like I'd forgotten who the characters were, or if I had forgotten where we were in the plot, I'd start listening and be like, oh yeah, we've just done this and we're about to do this. It was a very well told story and I rated it 4 stars. I think it was absolutely deserved 4 stars. I downloaded the sequel audiobook and picked it up on my Kindle because the sequel is a 42-hour audiobook. So I didn't want to get the physical because I would never read it. It was I might get it as a trophy if I ever get around to reading it. But the thing with this series, I think it's somewhat renowned within the people who know this series. But the author, Patrick Rothfuss, I think he was writing this series either with or for his dad. And then his dad passed away. So there's 2 books and a few spin-off novellas. But he said he probably will never finish the trilogy because he was doing it either with or for his dad, and his dad's not around anymore, so he finds that too difficult. So it's like, okay, I want to read this series because I have this novella and I enjoyed book 1, but I know that when I finish book 2, there's not a book 3 to turn to, and there's not even I think it's been over a decade. The likelihood that book 3 is ever going to come out is slim to none. So I do feel a bit demotivated with the series, but I did really like book 1, and I think I will read book 2 is another one that's with the Played to Prisoner series. It's another one that's on my mental back burner. So I enjoyed this book. I rated it 4 stars, but I'm a bit hesitant about reading more of the series because I know it's incomplete. Then we're into the last 2. Book 23 is 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot, which is a paranormal YA LGBTQ plus romance ? Not really romance. There's a romance element, but it's definitely not part of the plot. And I rated it 5 stars. It was so much fun. It was the kind of paranormal, I think it's also described as a horror book, which there are some gory bits in there, but it's definitely very light on the horror as someone who is definitely not a horror reader. But I found the paranormal system, it reminded me why the word normal is in paranormal, because it's the kind of thing that could be real. It's like, yeah, you know what? I would not be surprised if this was a real thing. I thought the characters in this story they felt so immediately real. I felt so immediately connected to them. I was immediately rooting for the main character. And I just thought, yeah, it was fun. It was really interesting. The characters were really diverse and they were really well thought out. I rated this 5 stars. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know if it's a sequel. I've been told that they can be read as standalones, but I think they're about the same characters. There is a sequel that I will be reading at some point. I'm very excited about it, but this was so much fun. If you've ever been to York or you live in or around York, I think you really need to read this, because I read this shortly after visiting York because my sibling lives there, and it felt so much more immersive to be able to fully picture where the story was being set. It was absolutely brilliant. Genuinely so underrated. I wish there was an audiobook, because it would make this book, that's the one thing that's not accessible about this book. But if they need an audiobook narrator, I'm not the one to do it, but I will if I have to. Then last but by no means least, book 24 is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm very, very glad to have read my first J.R.R. Tolkien this year. I finally got around to reading it. I also listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Andy Serkis, who plays Gollum in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. And he is fantastic. It was genuinely one of the best audiobooks I listened to last year, because he is just he doesn't just tell the story, he lives it. He sings all the songs, he does all the voices. There's no denying that he is a properly good actor. Like, however stupid that sounds coming out of my mouth, he is so, so talented, and the audiobook is just incredible. And it made me want to read The Lord of the Rings, which is generally quite an intimidating series, but I genuinely intend to read Lord of the Rings at some point. And I'm going to do it via audiobook so I can listen to Andy Serkis again. I rated The Hobbit 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I didn't realise that it was so much of a children's book, I think. I had it in my head that it was kind of like an adult, complex fantasy book, but then, it's something that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote for his children. And I think it started as their bedtime stories. So it's a very child-friendly narrative, especially when it's being read to you in such an immersive way as by Andy Serkis. And yeah, it was fantastic. I genuinely really enjoyed it. So another one I rated 4 stars. In total, I managed to read 18 out of 24 books. So I have a success rate of 75%, which, considering the year before I managed to read 5 out of the 23 books I chose for my annual TBR, I'm considering that a success. I'm not considering the rest of these books on this list books that I was avoiding. I still really want to read the remaining 6 that I didn't get round to. But the fact that there's only 6, I'm genuinely really pleased. I'm really proud of myself. And do I think I will have learnt a lesson and be better in 2025? Hopefully. Maybe this is the year I actually do it. But I'm genuinely really pleased, not only with the fact that I managed to read 75% of my annual TBR, But the fact that I picked so many books that I actually really did enjoy, but then also the books that I did pick out of my TBR jar took me by surprise. It made me think, you know what, actually, I do have quite good taste. And I do tend to pick books that I do enjoy. There's some books on here that I didn't love, but they're generally the TikTok recommendations and ones that I've seen people talking about online. It just reminds me that actually everyone's opinion is subjective, and just because someone loves a book doesn't mean that I will. And if someone hates a book, it also doesn't mean that I will. So yeah, I'm really pleased with this list. It's a really good collection of books. And now that I've done my library rearrange and all of these 2 shelves behind me are my unread TBR, and I have an official number of unread books, I am more determined than ever. I went to Waterstones Piccadilly yesterday and I didn't buy anything. Waterstones Piccadilly is the biggest Waterstones in England, in the UK, if not Europe. There's 5 floors of books and I didn't buy any. And I'm very proud of myself. So hopefully 2025 will be a better year for my TBR. Perhaps I'll be able to improve on my success rate in my annual TBR. But those are the 24 books I attempted to read in 2024, and the 18 of them I actually managed to read. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you managed to get to the end, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're reading a great book, and I'll see you next time for another bookish video. Bye!